Hello everyone, it is June 19th, 2020, and I am recording this video to talk about the books I've been reading this month, especially the books that I'm still reading, not the ones that I completed this month. I have a list of 6 books, so let's begin with the first one, which is the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. I've spent about 12 days so far in small portions. I spent on average about half an hour to an hour reading, and then I spent some time thinking in silence and taking some notes until the next day when I continue reading. The Nicomachean Ethics, and reading this is part of one of my side projects to go through a list of 14 key philosophical texts, key foundational texts in Western philosophy, in a particular order, and discussing them. A very brief note I'd like to add about translation. The translation that I would recommend is one done by Davood Rocha. To illustrate why I personally prefer that translation, let me read a passage from the Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, with 2 other translations. So this first translation is by Barnes and Kinna. And the passage I'm going to read is from Book 10. It's a passage in which Aristotle is talking about pleasure or enjoyment and its place, its relation to activities, human activities. Quote, "For example, it is those who take delight in geometry that become geometers and grasp the various propositions better. And similarly, those who love music or architecture and so on make progress in their task by taking delight in it. And the pleasures increase the exercises, and what increases a thing is appropriate to it. And what is appropriate to things, different in kind, itself differs in kind." End quote. If I only had this translation, this passage would have been probably completely incomprehensible to me. Let's move to another translation. This one is done by Terence Irwin. Quote, "If, for instance, we enjoy doing geometry, we become better geometers and understand each question better. And similarly, lovers of music, building, and so on improve at their proper function when they enjoy it. Each pleasure increases the activity. What increases it is proper to it. And since the activities are different in species, what is proper to them is also different in species." Now, the reason why I found Ross's translation much more illuminating is that he uses the word intensify instead of increase, and I think that's a key advantage. So think about this. When we take pleasure in an activity, that pleasure intensifies the activity. It doesn't increase necessarily the number of hours we spend on it, but it adds depth and intensity to the activity. So imagine 2 scenarios in which I'm reading this book. In one scenario, I'm enjoying the activity of reading. In another scenario, I'm not enjoying the reading. When I'm enjoying the reading, my activity has additional depth and intensity. My enjoyment intensifies the activity of reading. And the pleasure of reading is proper to the activity of reading. It is an inherent part of the activity of reading. It is not an alien part that is later added. The activity of the enjoyment in reading is part of reading. Part of what it means to really properly read a text is to enjoy reading it. Otherwise, it is not, it wouldn't really make the same sense. It doesn't carry the same meaning when we say I'm reading something. It's a different kind of task. This passage is appropriate because it leads to the next book that I wanted to mention, and that is Sam Rocha's book, Folk Phenomenology. Folk Phenomenology has a subtitle, which is Education, Study, and the Human Person. This is a book published in 2015, but it is based on Sam's PhD dissertation, I believe. So it was written before that other book, A Primer for Philosophy and Education. So even though I read the primer first before reading Folk Phenomenology, I would say, if I were to recommend Sam's work to other people, I would say begin with Folk Phenomenology. Well, maybe not begin with folk phenomenology. Begin with some other works, introductory text on phenomenology. Maybe you have read a little bit of the Cartesian Meditations by Husserl, or the idea of phenomenology based on a lecture series by Husserl, or maybe another introduction, more contemporary introduction by Dan Zahavi or Sean Gallagher. Know a little bit about phenomenology, concepts like intentionality, the phenomenological approach to metaphysics and ontology. With that background, I think folk phenomenology would be both more clear and more enjoyable. I'm planning to devote another entire video to reviewing folk phenomenology, so I won't say much about it. But remember those quotes that I read from Aristotle's Ethics. The relationship between enjoyment, desire, intensity, and the human way of relating to things like study and education, reality, the way we exist and the way we are organized, the way our life subsists, to borrow one of Sam's key terms in this work, and how our existence and our subsistence is within a broader context of being. So, let's move to the next book, which is Principles of NonPhilosophy by Francois Laruelle. This is a book that is very difficult to read, but if you have a tendency towards critique as a method of study, critical thinking, a critical approach to other material, including philosophy or science, I think a familiarity with Laruelle's work, especially Principles of NonPhilosophy, studying Laruelle's NonPhilosophy would be beneficial, just because of the spirit that is at work in his writing. He's very difficult to read because he doesn't use many examples, and he's trying very hard to avoid the conventional way of writing philosophy. So his text is unexpected. He uses it in a conversation between Laruelle and Derrida. Laruelle says that I'm using philosophical language to not do philosophy. So he's doing a different kind of activity. And non-philosophy, we could say, as he says, it uses philosophy as its material and as its starting point. And it has a very strange asymmetrical relationship with philosophy. So non-philosophy and philosophy. I'll say more about Laruelle and non-philosophy hopefully later on. Just to say that I've spent about 3 weeks to read just 15 pages of this book. So that's just an indication of how difficult it is. I'm thankful to Glenn Wallace for introducing this work to me. Next is Gabriel Marcel, and I'm thankful to Greg Sadler and his videos, his YouTube channel, for introducing Gabriel Marcel, an important existential philosopher, Catholic philosopher. Unlike Laruelle, he uses a lot of concrete references to situations, to issues, and he uses examples and concrete reality. He wants his philosophy and his writing to be grounded and in contact with everyday concerns and not pure speculation. This is a book that I started reading a few years ago, and I read the first 4 chapters, and then I set it aside, and I picked it up again recently, and this time I'm almost done reading it. In this book, he writes about technology, he writes about atomization, writes about the mass society, the spirit of abstraction that regards everybody in the same way with respect to the same categories. So Marcel would be someone who would be very useful to criticize, for example, among other things, the quantitative approach to social or human sciences. Quantitative social sciences, for example, a very, I think, fruitful way to critically engage with social sciences, quantitative social sciences, big data, and similar approaches. That kind of critique can be grounded in Gabriel Marcel's work. Now, speaking of big data, that's another item on the list. I'm reading with my fellow members of the book club we have, Big Data, a very short introduction by Don Holmes. Needless to say, this is not a philosophical work, but it provides good, useful material to think about. Big data in relation to our everyday life, the things we do, the things that we are connected with, and without really knowing how we are participating in things with processes that are collecting a massive amount of data about us, collecting and storing a lot of information. And that comes with a whole way of treating and thinking about the human person that deserves critical engagement with. So that's big data. Also, this short introduction includes implications and applications of big data in the domains of medicine, medical sciences, and encryptions, and security, cybersecurity, and politics. Last but not least, this is number 6 in the list, is Anarchism, a Beginner's Guide, written by Ruth Kinna. This would be a good place to start being introduced to anarchism. I wouldn't say I'm an anarchist yet, at least, because it still seems to me to be an extremely untenable and romantic position, political orientation to have. But it would be very useful to be introduced and to read about anarchism, what it is, what motivates it. A lot of its motivations are well justified and reasonable, if not all styles of solutions that call themselves anarchists. For me, it was very informative to read about anarchist critique of Marxism. Marxism, the common critiques of Marxism that we are used to hearing about come from capitalism. But that is not a very effective way to criticize Marxism. I think the most convincing and compelling critique of Marxism that I've seen so far is present, and actually it is discussed in this Beginner's Guide to Anarchism by Ruth Kinna. So I'm reading this book because I'm a member of the Anarchist Reading Circle, which is a satellite reading group, part of Insight Seminars, which is run by Glenn Wallace. All right, I think that's good for now, for this month's list of readings. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will speak with you in the next video.